I'm going to run through some of the essentials in the story of living in Victorian Dublin from the perspective of the greater part of the population, because of course the majority of the people were living in the city in tenement dwellings. So the first image I have here, just picking up on our dates, we're talking about living in Dublin during the Victorian era. So we're talking about 1830s to 1901, the long reign of Queen Victoria. And when we start out picking up exactly on what Susan said already, which is we have a very tightly constrained city. You can see here again, I don't need to emphasize this, we have it very much within the canals and within the circular roads of the city, and a very tight housing stock. What's interesting in the next image, which is the image of Dublin City from the Tom's Directory in 1898, the end of the century, you can see here, if you were to go back and block up section by section, you'd see that the whole west is much as it was already. There isn't that much extensive new building. The new building are in the townships here on the south side, Rathmines and Rathgar, the Pembroke Township, the Clontarf Township and the Drumcondra Township that got mentioned already. And again, extending very much along, say, Bagot Street, Blackrock Road, etc. So the city itself, for the majority of the people, is still within the original early core. So what you know already, this is a repeating, I think what everyone here will know, that the decay of large single-family townhouses into slum tenements is a feature of Dublin's urban history, and it was in train even before the Act of Union, but very much became very obvious in the 1830s, and most dramatic in the 1850s with the collapse of the central administration and control of the Gardiner estate, the ownership of the Gardiner estate. When I was a BA student 100 years ago, my project was on the Pembroke estate in the south inner city, and I looked at the villages of Ringsend and Irishtown, ended up on that. But I became aware exactly what Susan was talking about, the great control and the influence and the power that the Pembroke estate had over its management of leases and its management of property development, and comparing that with what happened in the North City, which is in the Gardiner estate area. It's only one of several estates, but it's a big one, and basically it's been taken over by bandits. They're cowboy builders, they're individuals, and there's really very hard to keep any sort of regulation on the use of those large houses. So it takes over, kind of takes up speed from the 1850s, most dramatically exposed in the 1913 Church Street Inquiry. And if anyone knows Christian Corlett's work on Darkest Dublin, which is just really superb introduction and kind of summary of this. So I could go through an immense amount of evidence for this. I like this date because this is from the 1836 Poor Inquiry, 1833 to 36, they're taking evidence, which is the background to the setting up of the what we know as the workhouse system, the Poor Law Union, and a local clergyman from St. Michan's Church near Church Street. He talks about how houses held by respectable people are now in a wretched condition, being let in rooms at least 3/4 of which may now be called poor. And he keeps talking about how there are 2 or 3 families in each room, and if you were to multiply the evidence from all the different witnesses to that inquiry relating to the condition of Dublin, you could have nothing but a very depressed view of the city. The statistics vary hugely. Some talk about having 9 out of 10 families, our households are headed by women, and the women of the most destitute in this North City area. Others have contradictions around those statistics, but they're all going in the same very dismal direction. And it's by One of the reasons, again, for the continual migration to the city is just the story of poverty across the country, very mobile population, constant movement out for people looking for, in the hopes of employment. It's a kind of a migration crisis in the mid-19th century. Very, very mobile. Britain to Ireland, I mean, we're not talking about a barrier between Britain and Ireland, we're talking about a highway, the Irish Sea being so easily traversed. And for example, this piece is taken from the minutes of the North Dublin Union during the famine, the commissioners' meeting, the local guardians, I should say, meeting, and one of the members complaining about how they're flocking to the city. They're squatting in the deserted mansions of the noble and the untenanted dwellings of the once opulent merchants. It's the story of commerce fleeing the city, and the economic, the drivers of commerce decamping outside the city, that of course much more in the later 19th century, but the kind of downturn in the economy that followed on the Act of Union and took particular hold in the 1830s with the cholera epidemics and then successive famine and disease outbreaks right through until the great catastrophe of the famine. It's a succession of great, as I said, disease outbreaks, and so it's an ongoing story. The point I'm making, it's getting worse, it's repetitive, and it's focusing in particular, all of the attention is focusing in particular on the reuse of the Dublin city. The existing housing stock has been reused by local house farmers, is the term that's used very often. These would be slum landlords or local landlords. And it's the issue of sewage, as it happens in the suburbs as well. It's the issue of sewage and the spread of typhoid or any disease carried by dirty water, contaminated water. It's the sewage and water question, of course, that precipitates action in the city as it does in the suburbs, because disease is no respecter of class. And the report, the 1879 report on the sewage and drainage, keeps going back to the fact that these are single family dwellings designed for another era, when you had a single family with a servant class, and you had the toilet accommodation was fine for one family, but simply where you had up to 70 or 80 persons in the house, it was totally inadequate. There's always kind of the moral dilemma. I love this story actually in the 1870s as well, where whether or not we will promote the introduction of flush toilets and water closets, and of course the political opinion is that the people of Dublin are so dirty they would never learn the habits of how to use flush toilets properly, that would be just beyond, culturally beyond the poor of the city of Dublin. So there's a nice debate going on there. The excessive death rate is constantly then being brought back to the level of overcrowding and being brought back again to the level of poverty, underpinned by the poverty of the citizens. What we talk about, 1/3 of the people of Dublin living in single room tenements. That's the statistic that matters, because this is what is real life, ordinary life, this living very, very close together for the majority of the city centre population. When you count up the whole Dublin district, of course, the statistic isn't quite so startling, but for the city centre areas, it's the vast majority of the citizens are in single room accommodation. The use and the reuse of this kind of inherited housing stock for family accommodation is commented on by every possible visitor. It becomes kind of it's iconic of Dublin in the worst sense, right up until the 1930s. You have visitors coming and talking about how the better houses, particularly around Gardiner Street, which of course is near the North Wall, where you have visitors coming in, the first they meet is this extraordinary phenomenon of these very, very large houses being multiple occupancy. I would like to mention that they talk here about Sarah Atkinson, who's a very good observer and very astute writer, very critical eye. She talks about how you have the princely residences, sometimes it's simply downgrading, and then she is entertained by the fact that very often some of these large houses have other uses. In this case, she picks up how and catalogues how some of these grand houses have become the residence used for schools, used for hostels, used for hospitals, used for asylums, and she talks about how she's a very nationalist writer, and she talks about how I should say she's a very Catholic writer, a very well-informed, well-travelled Catholic writer, and she's very entertained by these Catholic institutions taking control, and reads it as the resurgence of Catholicism. But a good example here, this is a later map, of course, the 1925 map here of the Civic Survey map, and picking up one of the examples would be Henrietta Street, which is a very, very fine, one of the finest of the Georgian townhouses, built for Luke Gardiner himself, and there's a story there about the use of these. I want to bring us back here, just as we're very short in time, and pick up maybe just 2 or 3 little points. We're here in the Royal Exchange, right here in the city centre, and this is just a redrawing of the 1846 first manuscript survey of Dublin, Ordnance survey, which is the base map for the valuation. And what you have here is, while you have Parliament Street here, which is the work of the Wide Street Commissioners, you can see even then the higgledy-piggledy, tight, very congested medieval fabric that's still evident in the mid-19th century. So you've got kind of 2 stories. You've got little set pieces of the 18th century Wide Street Commissioner sponsored or promoted set pieces of this redesign, and then you have the inherited much earlier, much tighter, much more organic medieval fabric. And you have as well the example, this is a North City example here, which is the redesign of the whole area around the forecourts on the north side, which again had a huge, was hugely congested in the early 19th century. The numbers, the figures, every statistical survey that you have, Dublin City, no matter how you cut and dice it, Dublin City comes out as the city in the British Isles with the greatest number of one-roomed tenement dwellings and the greatest concentration of families in one-roomed dwellings of households. So they look at the stats in different ways, and regrettably Ireland comes out repeatedly. The business that I was interested in on this stat, which is the the building of first-class dwellings, and you can see here from 1841, 51, 61, 71, 81, 91, right through to 1911, almost however you look at it, there is almost no high quality or good quality top range investment in urban building in Dublin City right across the 19th century, and you know why. Susan has indicated that. So even while this refers to the number of families in accommodation. So first-class accommodation is where you have a first-class house occupied by a single family. I better just leave that point. You can look at that again. The deaths, again, the death rates no matter again how you compared and contrasted, and even as the death rate comes down, the death rate in Dublin City is topping the death rate across other Irish cities and across the British Isles. There are lots of statistical debates around it, but this is compared with Glasgow or compared with Edinburgh, which had notoriously high death rates. The internal divisions of the houses, this is what you know. They're not just talking about the tallest houses, the 4-storey over basement, but other houses. So a whole range of the Dublin City property is reused for single family occupation. In this case, the one I have there is a Fade Street, which is quite a good example of Stephen's Green there, and because you've got the nice skylight, and these are very handsome merchant houses in their day. I did this stats business where I was going street by street and working out what proportion of each street was in tenements, and what is happening here, over a third, there are large parts of the city where over the third of the housing, or at least a third of the premises, are listed as tenements. So there are very, very tight streets and concentrations where they're almost exclusively, are really exclusively tenement dwellings. That is the house type, or at least the type of accommodation available. And in this case, this is the one I'm picking up here. This is 1900. This is O'Connell Street, nice and wide. And we're talking here about Gardiner Street beside it. And we're talking here about Marlborough Street, where the Pro Cathedral is. And you can see here Marlborough Street, and you see all of this area behind O'Connell Street, for example, being largely a tenement dwelling. There is a massive amount of dereliction in the city, which is part of the experience of tenement living in the city, because there's lots of where from 1879, when the corporation started closing houses as unfit for habitation, because there was no investment in new building, you have a huge number of derelict and abandoned buildings as part of if you were visiting or working there, this would be part of your daily reality. This is a 1913 picture from the darkest Dublin, but this is common. All of the time, while I'm rushing to make a few points and painting a very black and white picture, there was never such a thing as a black and white picture of life. For some people, if you were a single family, maybe a husband and wife and one child, and you occupied a front room in Henrietta Street, and your mother was in the other room and your family were around you, and you had reasonable space, and the toilet was well kept, and you had access to clean water, it could be quite a good setup. Where you were in the house, the room you took, the cellar dwelling, whether you were in cellars or whether you were at the top floor, the cellar dwelling cellars were forbidden for occupation from, I think there's an 1845, did you say 1845, 1847 regulation, but it really only takes off with the Public Health Act, the one that's brought in, the Irish one of 1878, where they start enforcing it. And then what we have at the same time is this Public Health Act enforcing the closure of cellar dwellings. I have Vincent de Paul lists where people are still living in cellars. So you have squatting or occupation of substandard housing even while you have closures. So there is this social gradation within the houses, and then gradation between streets. And the other point, I'm going to just leave it, the points there. The vast majority of the population, this is the type of accommodation that's available. And we know a huge amount about it because it's the despair of both sanitary and housing officials, and it's extraordinarily well covered in different reports. But of course, what they're always focusing on, because of the nature of many of the sources, they're focusing on the problems in the housing, which makes it difficult to get other aspects of life. But a few things we can say, I'm just going to skip through, a few things we can say For example, from one of my charity sources, looking at the Ladies Association of Charity, this worked in the North Inner City in that Gardiner Street area, did house-to-house visitation. We have their relief books from 1851 onwards, and they wrote their little annual reports, and I just quote one little piece where this is an 1861 report, 10th report, where one of the ladies reports on visiting in the parish of Gardiner Street, and she says, "Oh, if the ladies of the parish and of the city could be induced to join us as lady visitors. Here, 2 sisters dwell. They've lived together, worked together during life. Now one is sick. You enter the little room. It is almost dark, for 4 of the 6 panes of glass are patched with paper to keep out the cold. There is no fire, very little bed covering. 1 and 3 must be paid weekly for the rent. The income is now 6 a day, with 1 or 2 idle days, usually in the week. This poor creature lies upon her sick bed all day, suffers in silence. Her sister comes home later in the evening, tries to light a little fire, to prepare a little food. A cup of miserable tea and a little dry bread, the whole costing about 2 form the chief and only 1 meal of the 2 sisters. This is how the poor live and how the sick poor suffer. And yet, when we entered that poor room, the poor sick sister was saying her beads for the conversion of sinners. Yes, for the cold world that surrounded her." So lots of little anecdotal pieces that you could pick out from these visits that give you a little more. One of the ladies' reports is about how somebody had died and they were keening in Irish, which of course these lady visitors didn't think much of at all. They thought it was half savage, and they tried to say the rosary with them in English. But they had a heart for them, they had a feel for them. They also talk about the diet of tea and bread and tea, tea and bread, and how ubiquitous that is. But they also give evidence for all the little networks of support, because of course the first, your support network were your family and your neighbours, and very local, very intense and very important. This was, and I just go on to the next one, and this is an example from my own work. These are the little dots, and here, these are donors on one side, those who donated to the charity. Sorry, the 1855 list here. The round dots are those who got help. Roundy dots, they got help from the Ladies of Charity. And you can see around Gloucester Street, Sean McDermott Street, in the back lanes and alleyways here where you've all of these round dots, these are people who got help. The triangles are people who donated. These are the ladies who helped, and the ones with the square around them are ladies who we know their name and address, and they were part of the committee and part of the visitors. So you can build up this little local intimate geography of those who helped. These are the helpers, the lady visitors along the main street, and in behind are those who got help. And when you go to 1895, that's where it gets very interesting. All of the houses which you track down, you can track them week by week, are becoming the houses of those getting relief. There's 70 persons in it, and a house that was where there were a mother and a daughter were living in maybe very respectable lodgings. By the 1890s, you can track the decline, and I'm afraid it's all in one direction. So even while you have some house clearances, you still have people from the laneways moving out into the larger houses. There's lots of evidence on how precarious the income of people was, how they managed, particularly in dealing, in baskets, in street dealing, in laundry work, in taking in laundry, and in working in laundries all over the city, and above all in domestic work. There is a very big unskilled labour, pool of labour for women in particular, in domestic service, in laundry, in cleaning, and in dealing. And for men, very much unskilled. The predominant work is short-term, weekly work in unskilled occupations, very often tied to the port with the ships coming in, where you'd be employed for a couple of days and then nobody needed for another few days, another week or two. So very precarious, that's the point I'm making, which of course underpins this reliance on poor accommodation. Just want to mention maybe one last point here on this. We're here in the Royal Exchange, and behind us here, this is the Dublin Castle, and some of you will know as you come in here, Little Ship Street and Great Ship Street, and you know along the side of the castle here, these are the, they're now used part of the tax revenue offices, and the Ordnance Office there, you know it out the back, which is the Chester Beatty Library today. And if you look, this is turned upside down, that's why I showed you that, because this is the Dublin Castle, Ship Street, Barracks, and along here, along Ship Street. And we have another kind of slum in the 19th century city, which are the slums attached to the barracks. They're kind of hidden slums. In the slum here for the, I think I have it on the next slide, yeah, the 1861 report, and there is an investigation post-Crimea into the shocking condition of barracks and hospitals around the British Empire, and Florence Nightingale was involved in this, and they're beginning to realise that actually, you know, the soldiers are, you know, more likely to die in the barracks than they are, or in the hospital, than they are on the battlefield. And in comparison with, for example, the hospital treatment of soldiers in the French army and in the Prussian army, they had much, you know, much way ahead of what was being done for soldiers in the British army. And one of the pieces I was interested in when I was looking at this was, say, the Ship Street. The British government had taken houses here, ordinary townhouses, which hadn't been in tenements, and they used them then, they took them in as barracks. They used them as barracks, they didn't do too much with them, but they housed soldiers in them. And by 1862, there were 2 rooms with regulation space for 1 man. So the space that the regulation said for 1 man was occupied by 10 persons in each case. Men, women and children. All of the rooms held over twice the regulation allowed. The allowed regulation space, which was very tight per cubic metre, allowed 453 men to be accommodated. The healthy regulation space was higher, would have brought that number down, but even at the old regulation, sanitary regulations, would have allowed 453 men to be accommodated, and the number of persons in the Ship Street was 1,377. Men, women and children. There was no division between married men and single men. There was no ablution rooms for the men, no wash houses for clothes, no kitchen, no cookhouse, and it was probably worse than any of the Dublin city slums by which it was so closely surrounded. And I'm afraid I've worked on Galway, and Galway is the match of this as well. But Ship Street had particularly large numbers, and it's the beginning of pushing for married men's quarters. They're all basically under the noses of the British Army, families occupying the space for 1 man, and multiplying the problems with it. Okay, I think I'm going to have to hold it at that. I am happy, I'm around in the afternoon as well, I will be back. I am happy to take questions with anything, and I am accessible. I'm in Maynooth. I can be discovered or found, and I think I'll just leave it as that. The one I had there was simply that if you look at the 1913 Sackville Street, the police attack material, and if you look at the Church Street housing collapse, of 1913, even though they have no connection to each other. Political connections were made later, but they're actually two separate events. The inquiries, the government inquiries that went into that are probably, they're online, they're House of Commons papers, and I think they're one of the best insights to internal living conditions, the evidence of, in the police case, the evidence of police brutality, and in the Church Street, the collapse story, the evidence of the intricate subdivision and tenancy arrangements there give very kind of human aspects to the story, not just the kind of sanitary and medical officer reports. Okay, thanks.